Thank you, honorable members. The floor is now open for debate. I recognize the leader of the opposition, Honorable Myron Walwyn.
Much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this is a very hefty piece of legislation. And it follows, Madam Speaker, some similar trends to some of the bills that we were discussing, where we saw that there were some possible incursions on civil liberties, and also where authority, if not properly used, could be abused. It is one of those bills, Madam Speaker, that I can support, but my support is subject to certain things that must happen. And when I get to that place in the bill where it's of major concern to me, I will tell you whether I can support or not. Obviously, my support would have to come in the committee stage, because what I'm suggesting, I believe, is very important, Madam Speaker, for the functioning of the bill. Madam Speaker, we know, or we may not know, that a country can exercise jurisdiction over a vessel that's registered within that country and one that's flying its flag. And that jurisdiction comes from internationally recognized principles that a country may regulate the conduct of its nationals wherever, Madam Speaker, they're located. And you can see that, for instance, in section 430B of the bill, where if a Virgin Islands ship is involved in a criminal matter in foreign waters, before they enter the ship, wherever the ship is, the authority of the Honorable Attorney General is required. Madam Speaker, I'll start off first by echoing similar sentiments raised by the Honorable Deputy Premier. And Madam Speaker, he is quite right in what he's saying in relation to the powers that are given to the governor in this particular bill. He also read out, Madam Speaker, the requisite sections of the Constitution, which I agree with. But it's also important to know that the shipping registry is a body corporate, is it not? And it is under the purview of the Premier, under the Premier's office. And we continue to see these incursions on statutory corporations. And I don't know when we are going to understand it. I don't know if it's that we're deliberately trying not to understand. But a statutory corporation has its own legal personality. It has its board of directors that have fiduciary responsibilities and other responsibilities to the organization. Even the Premier himself can't do certain things when it comes to statutory corporations that are under his purview. So certainly for the governor to be making regulations with regards to the shipping registry certainly is not the right approach. And I certainly support that wherever the governor appears in the document, and it's not personal in any way, wherever governor appears, Madam Speaker, changes has to be made where the minister who has conduct of the subject is the person who is responsible. Now, Madam Speaker, the bill does a lot of cleaning up of things that deals with laws of the sea and different things to make sure that we are compliant. It also, we see where arrangements are made for inserting the United Kingdom in certain parts. Obviously, that has to do somewhat with the United Kingdom no longer being in the EU. I also see, Madam Speaker, in Section 4, implementation of Safety Convention and to have its force of law in 172A. And I'm raising this just as a side before I get into the substantive parts of the bill, because when you look at the interpretation of ship in the substantive legislation, it includes every description of vessel used in navigation. And I remember just the other day when we were discussing the tobacco bill, I raised the concern that of many citizens in this country about the emission of smoke from cruise ships. And if we're looking at the safety regulations, I imagine there must be something in those regulations that will speak to environmental concerns. We have a lot of people here who have cancer. Matter of fact, a number of persons who are suffering from cancer called me about that situation with that smoke. We don't know what is being emitted in the atmosphere. And so, Minister of Health, as I speak, I look at you. We have to make sure that our people are protected and that they're breathing clean air. Madam Speaker, I want to go to Section 430A, that installation of that section. 430A. And the heading says application of maritime enforcement powers in general. And it says in 430A, a law enforcement officer, and I will get to that a little further down, may, for the purpose of preventing, detecting, investigating, or prosecuting a criminal offense, exercise any of the maritime enforcement powers. And it says in relation to a Virgin Islands ship in Virgin Islands waters, foreign waters or international waters. B, a ship without nationality in Virgin Islands waters or international waters. A foreign ship in the Virgin Islands waters or international waters. And a ship registered under the law of a recognized jurisdiction in the Virgin Islands waters or in international waters. And recognized jurisdictions are at Schedule 7, Madam Speaker, of the amendment. I want to look first, Madam Speaker, at that term, general criminal offense. And these sections, these 430 sections, A, B, C, that go all the way to K, Madam Speaker, those sections were lifted almost verbatim from the Police and Crime Act of 2017 in the United Kingdom. Almost verbatim in some respects. We chuck in things like we like to chuck in for our own purposes, and of course I will catch those things and deal with them at the appropriate time. But that's where it came from. And Madam Speaker, when this bill was being debated in the UK, there was great concern around this issue of general criminal offense. Because a general criminal offense, Madam Speaker, as is defined in 430A 3B, is an offense under the law of the Virgin Islands other than an offense under this act or regulations made under it. So essentially, any law that's under the criminal code will be considered a general offense. There was one argument being put forward by a member of the House of Lords, and he used the example of stealing a Mars bar. That would be considered a general offense. Are we saying that you're going to stop a ship, you're going to detain it, you're going to jump on it, you're going to do all manner of things if somebody steals a Mars bar? And that is what really happens when you use that term, general criminal offense. Because really, what this is supposed to be doing is dealing with serious offenses. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, murder, rape, the most serious of offenses. And so even though the term general criminal offense still obtains in the Police and Crime 2017 Act, I think that we can do a little better in terms of narrowing down on what sort of offenses we really mean, as opposed to having it simply be a general criminal offense. When you go on to section 2 of 430A, the maritime enforcement powers are set out in section 430D, the power to stop, board, divert, and detain. B, section 430E, the power to search and obtain. And C, section 430F, the power of arrest and seizure. And Madam Speaker, you would know very well that these are very, very serious powers that a law enforcement officer will have. As a matter of fact, if he was on land operating, for the powers of arrest and seizure, he would require a warrant. Because of the exigencies of the situation on water, a warrant would not be practical. By the time you get to the courthouse and come back, the boat done gone. So, Madam Speaker, it is important that proper safeguards are put in place for the use of those powers that the police officer will exercise. And when you go through the bill, Madam Speaker, there is an absence of proper oversight. An absence of proper oversight in relation to the exercising of those powers. And I will show you what I mean, Madam Speaker, when I get there. Now, 3A says, for the purpose of this part, A, the following persons are law enforcement officers. 1, a constable who is a member of a Royal Virgin Islands police force. And 2, a person of a description specified in regulations made by the governor. Now, we don't talk about the governor part already. I do not believe that he should be making any regulations in relation to this, for the reasons I've given before and the reasons given by the Honorable Deputy Premier. But it says a constable who is a member of the Royal Virgin Islands Police Force. And a constable, Madam Speaker, could be anybody who just joined the police force. Yes? Yes? I'm looking at the officers. Yes. A police officer who come with the last shower of rain. He just passed the police exam, and he's a constable. And you're going to drop these major powers to go in and detain and seize assets and do all kinds of things, and you're going to give that to a constable who just come with the last shower of rain? To me, that is not the wisest thing. There has to be some level of experience, because you don't have that oversight. If that constable wanted to exercise some of these powers, Madam Speaker, on land, he would have to go to get a warrant. So how is it now on sea? We're taking on the body to see nothing out there but you and Jesus. And he got all this power out there, and he do whatever he wants with you out there. I don't think that's what we want. We have to look at that particular rank to make sure, Madam Speaker, that it is some officer of a particular rank with some level of experience. And then the question of a person of a description specified in regulations made by the governor. I know the question came up this morning in the discussions, Madam Speaker, in the informal session about customs, but I ain't buying it. I'm not buying it. The law is specifying, Madam Speaker, who an enforcement officer is for the purposes of carrying out this type of work. Because if anything happens on sea, and something happens, the lawyers are going to make sure that they go to the law, and we are going to look to see who had the requisite authority to do certain things. And if customs go and do certain things that the police, according to this act, should have conduct of, and they're not listed as a law enforcement officer, you could have some trouble. Additionally, Premier, some of your powers from the customs is going to the police. That is what I'm seeing happening here. I know that customs may have additional powers in other pieces of legislation, but they are responsible, as far as my knowledge goes, for border security. So why can't it be a shared responsibility? Why can't the customs officers also have the same level of powers? And I say to say, because even though, yes, you have customs officers in the UK, and you have police officers in the UK, when you look at their maritime enforcement powers, I will read out the designation of what a law enforcement officer means, right? And the law enforcement officer is essentially the same, has the same meaning as ours in this piece of legislation. And these persons are designated as law enforcement officers under their act, which we basically lifted and have put in here in those 430 pieces of legislation. And these are the persons who are enforcement officers. A designated customs official within the meaning of Part 1 of the Borders, Citizenship and Immigration Act. A designated NCA officer who is authorized by the Director General of the National Crime Agency. A member of the Ministry of the Defense Police, a member of the Royal Navy Police, or even a member of the Civil Nuclear Constabulary. So if in the UK itself, where we lifted the legislation from, customs officers have that level of authority to be enforcement officers under their act, why are customs officers being excluded here? They should be included in the legislation for the avoidance of doubt. Even if the powers might exist elsewhere, for the purposes of this act, it must list the customs officers. And I would even go as far as to say immigration officers as well, because they're all part of law enforcement, should be considered here as well. And then, Madam Speaker, Section 430B places some restrictions on the exercise of maritime enforcement powers. And it says, the authority of the Attorney General is required by law enforcement officers. The authority of the Attorney General is required before a law enforcement officer exercises any of the maritime enforcement powers in reliance on Section 430A1 in relation to a Virgin Islands ship in foreign waters. That's the point I opened up with when I said that a country would still have certain jurisdictions over their nationals, regardless of where they are. And so if a Virgin Islands ship is in foreign waters, you can't enter that ship unless you get the approval of the Attorney General. My concern is what this act doesn't do. It doesn't tell us if somebody's apprehended on a BVI ship. Before the police could come or BVI could be part of what is taking place, what happens to the suspect's rights during that intervening period? And that is something that certainly, Madam Speaker, during the committee stage, I would like to hear a bit more as to how that would be dealt with. 430C deals with the hot pursuit of ships from Virgin Islands waters. And I can't pretend to be an expert on this stuff because I am not. But when I look at hot pursuits, even in the Police and Crime Act of 2017, I saw the hot pursuits in the waters of England and Scotland, but this one seems to be the opposite. that it is from the Virgin Islands waters, and I'm wondering if that might be an error. But again, within the committee stage, we can talk about it. And it says in 430C, a law enforcement officer may, for the purpose of preventing, detecting, investigating, or prosecuting a general criminal offense, exercise any of the maritime enforcement powers in relation to a ship that is no longer in Virgin Islands waters if A, the ship is pursued from Virgin Islands waters. Immediately before the pursuit of the ship was in Virgin Islands waters. C, before the pursuit of the ship, a signal was given for it to stop. D, the signal was given in such a way as to be audible or visible from the ship. And E, the pursuit of the ship is not interrupted. And when I look to see how hot pursuit powers are used, they said that they're usually used for serious criminal offenses, drug trafficking, people smuggling, terrorism-related activity, and weapons smuggling. And that is why I'm suggesting that we remove this thing of general crime or general criminal offense and make it something, Madam Speaker, certainly a bit more serious. And of course, you know that there are conventions on the laws of the sea that deals with the whole issue of how hot pursuit is done. And 2 says, for the purposes of section 1E, pursuit is not interrupted by reason only of the fact that A, the method of carrying out the pursuit or the identity of the ship or aircraft carrying out the pursuit changes during the course of the pursuit. Now, this is where I have a challenge. And Madam Speaker, some of these bills, you become a student because you don't know the thing, then you have to go research them. And so I'm concerned in my research when I look at B. It says the identity of the ship or aircraft carrying out the pursuit changes during the course of the pursuit. And my understanding, Madam Speaker, of hot pursuit, the hot pursuit must be continuous and uninterrupted. So in the case of B, it says the identity of the ship or aircraft carrying out the pursuit changes during the course of the pursuit. Then it means that there's a break in the chase. Yes, it could be. It could be. You might have somebody stop and go on another vessel and jump on and go on another vessel and go. It doesn't necessarily have to be that I was chasing and my boat gone and somebody's come and chase immediately. There could be a break. And once there is a break in the pursuit, it is no longer hot pursuit. So we have to have a discussion. I might lose the argument, but I'll put up a good one because I don't think that this is consistent with how, Madam Speaker, this is supposed to be done. Article 430D speaks about the authority of the governor again and places some restrictions. We have already discussed how that is supposed to be addressed. 430E speaks to power to stop, board, divert, and detain. And it says here, this section applies if a law enforcement officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that a criminal offense, any criminal offense, is being or has been committed on a ship in relation to which the powers conferred by this section are exercisable by virtue of section 430A and 430C. And C deals with hot pursuit, and A deals with general maritime powers. A ship in relation to which those powers are so exercisable is otherwise being used in connection with the commission of a criminal offense. And 2 says the law enforcement officer, and these are the powers that the law enforcement officer has, this constable may stop the ship. Stop the ship. So he here on the ship, somebody sees a candy and he gonna stop the ship. Board the ship and require the ship to be taken to a port in the Virgin Islands or elsewhere and detained there. Those are sweeping powers without a warrant. that a constable could take. And it says here in 3, except as provided by subsection 5, the authority of the governor again, the governor all over the thing, is required before a law enforcement officer may exercise the power conferred by subsection 2C to require the ship to be taken to a port outside of the Virgin Islands. Then, Madam Speaker, I want to go on and look at 430G. The power of arrest and seizure. Now, this, Madam Speaker, for me, is the deal breaker. Remember I said that I could support or not support depending on what happened in committee stage, but committee stage is after the fact, really. But the powers of arrest and seizure, it says here that this section applies if a law enforcement officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that a general criminal offense has been or is being committed on a ship, in relation to which the powers conferred by this section are exercisable by virtue of section 430A, again which deals with the general powers, and 430C, which deals with hot pursuit. And it says, the law enforcement officer may arrest without a warrant anyone whom the officer has reasonable ground for suspecting to be guilty of the offense, and B, seize and retain anything found on the ship which appears to the officer to be evidence of the offense, other than anything that the officer has reasonable grounds to believe to be an item subject to legal privilege. Now, the powers of seizure and arrest are serious powers, particularly the powers of seizure, because you just can't seize things like that without a warrant and land. And so, Madam Speaker, there is nothing that gives directions, there's no code of practice that goes along with this section. And that is where the deal breaker is for me. There needs to be a code of practice, Madam Speaker, before these sections are implemented. And there's a code of practice under the exact provision in the Police and Crime Act. And I'll read a portion of it. It says, a person who is arrested or further arrested for an offense under the law of England and Wales under Section 90, that's where this whole section is on Section 90 of the Police and Crime Act, must be informed as soon as it is practicable that they are under arrest and the grounds and reason for the arrest. They make provisions for the caution. They have outlined the terms of the caution, what it should say, and it sets out strict guidelines, Madam Speaker, that the officer must follow, and also things that the persons who are being arrested and interviewed should know. It speaks about urgent interviews and how those are handled. It speaks to the power to obtain information, detention conditions, the records of arrest, a variety of things that is given to police officers, and a copy of this is also given to the persons who are being investigated so that they can know what their rights are. And you need to do that. You need to do that because there is no magistrate or judge out there. It's the police constable and them poor people and Jesus. And they can do whatever they want out there on that seat to those people. They don't know a thing about their rights or what is required. It's not the same as if you're on land. You may not be able to have a phone to make a phone call, do nothing. But you must know what your rights are. And the police must have something to guide them because they are dealing with some very serious civil liberties that could be abused, Madam Speaker, if we're not paying close attention. I go on, Madam Speaker, to portions of 430I. And the heading is Maritime Enforcement Powers, Other Supplementary Provisions. And it says a law enforcement officer may be accompanied by other persons and take equipment or material to assist the officer in the exercise of powers under this act. Same provision in the Police and Crime Act of 2017. I'm not sure if I like this section that deals with the police could be accompanied by other persons. I'm not sure because I don't know who those other persons are. Who would be the persons accompanying the police? I decided to go out there, I walk with my cousin and my uncle, and we're going out there, go on a boat to harass people. So I think we need to look at that to see the persons who are with the police must be other law enforcement officers. I don't think it should just be any old person to go out there with the police, to go on those boats. I don't subscribe to that. Again, particularly because of the nature of it and the fact that there is very little oversight. The law itself has got to protect both the officer and the persons who are going to be intercepted. It just can't be any old person who go out there with a police officer. It has to be somebody who is also a law enforcement officer, or somebody who can be given certain powers almost immediately for the purposes of what they're trying to do, and the powers can be revoked after. But it cannot be up to the police officer to grab who he wants to grab, to say some other person to go on the boats or the ships to do these sort of things. I don't think that is what we want to do. A law enforcement officer may use reasonable force if necessary in the performance of the functions under this part. And then 3 says, a person accompanying a law enforcement officer under subsection 1 may perform any of the officer's functions under this part, but under the officer's supervision. You see how dangerous that is? So he will walk with the cousin, he walk with the uncle, then go out on the ship so the people them steal some Mars bars. And now the cousin and the uncle have the same powers as the police officer. That's what we want? Amen. I see you agree with me. You can agree with me on TV, you know. I don't think that's what we want. You want to have, Madam Speaker, certainly more safeguards in place. And then 5 says, a law enforcement officer, and this is where, for instance, as I said, portions of these bills were lifted, Madam Speaker, from the Police and Crime Act. And this particular section that I'm reading, that's the Maritime Enforcement Powers, that came from Section 104 of the Act. But Section 104 of the Act does not have in number 5. We insert that ourselves. A law enforcement officer, this is 5. A law enforcement officer is not liable in any criminal or civil proceedings for anything done in the purported performance of functions under this part if the court is satisfied that the act was done in good faith and there were reasonable grounds for doing it. I don't like that. I don't like these kind of immunities that we're digging in all the time for law enforcement and other people who wielding certain powers because they act carelessly. When they know they have these powers, they don't exercise that duty of care that they're supposed to exercise because they believe they have the protection under the law. Now, explain to me, you out there on the open sea, you are ship with people and Jesus. And something happened out there that you do wrong. Who gonna come and say that you weren't acting in good faith? You make up your own story. Think anybody around? You, Jesus, and the ship. And so, as I said, when you're exercising those kind of powers, you have to make sure the appropriate safeguards, Madam Speaker, are in place. And we have to stop getting away from this thing that if you're carrying out a job, Madam Speaker, and you know you're doing it diligently, why you have to hide behind the law for protection for? The same thing happened with Hickenbottom. The same argument I make. You come and you make a report and you call everybody thief. And then you run back to the UK and you're going to put a law up there that you can't be sued. Man, you need to stand by your work. So why is it every time we see these things, we see all the time something coming where there's some sort of protection, hiding from something? No. Because you know what end up happening, Premier? You're going to get sued as Minister of Finance. The public's purse is going to pay. Because people are not exercising diligence in what they do. And so they can then do things that are outside the scope of their responsibilities. And then the people, the innocent people, the same people that we can take up and give a little food voucher to buy some food, is their little money from the treasury got to be shedding out all the time when these public officials do things that they're not supposed to be doing, because you'll get sued in the end. So these protection things that are in place, I'm sorry, I'm not in support of them. I'm not in support of them. And this section, as I said, is not in the section 104 in the Police and Crime Act. Every other provision is there. This portion was inserted by us. And then you go on, Madam Speaker, to 430J that speaks about maritime enforcement powers and offences. It says, a person commits an offence if the person, A, intentionally obstructs a law enforcement officer, fails without reasonable excuse to comply, and then 2 goes on to mention in providing information. But 3, if you look at 3, it says a law enforcement officer may arrest without a warrant anyone whom the officer has reasonable grounds for suspecting to be guilty of an offence under this section. So the section then creates an offence in subsection 3. But then look at 4. A person guilty of an offence under this section is liable on summary conviction to a fine. The section creates an offence with no particulars. You have to say what kind of fine it is. That's what the House of Assembly is supposed to do. In the UK section, it says, if I were to read this in the UK, in what the UK says, a person guilty of an offence under this section is liable on summary conviction to a fine at level 5. That's what the legislation says, and they have their levels for their fines. So we have to make sure we put in what the fines are here, because that is the job of the House of Assembly. And then, Madam Speaker, 430K. It says the governor, which we've already discussed this already, but even if we say minister, let's substitute and say minister. The minister may prepare and issue a code of practice in respect of the practice to be followed by law enforcement officers when arresting a person under the power conferred by section 430G. It says may. It's supposed to be shall. And that is where my problem resides. And the shall, I believe fervently that this code of practice needs to be put in place before effect is given to these sweeping powers to enforcement officers. I believe that fervently, because people's rights are going to get abrogated. And the same way we could look at the Police and Crime Act of 2017 and lift up the procedures and put them here, they have a code of practice as well. Lift up the same code of practice and bring it forward. Let us not go forward to put these powers in the hands of a constable with no proper guidance as to how those powers should be exercised, and without the people who are being affected knowing what their rights are. Because this is unfamiliar territory for people. There's some commonality with criminal laws and so forth in different jurisdictions, particularly in Commonwealth jurisdictions, but you're out there in the water. This is unfamiliar territory. And so people must be aware of their rights, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to read something as well in relation to 430K1. You see in there where we said the governor may prepare and issue a code of practice? I'm saying we should say shall and not may. But even if we want to put the premier, you can't put that responsibility, Madam Speaker, in the hands of one person to make that code of practice. And I will read to you what Baroness William of Trafford's speech was when they were bringing in to effect the piece of legislation and the code. At 6, he says, to ensure that the code will be practical and effective. And this is the same code that I'm saying, copy the code. The same way we copy the legislation. And there's nothing wrong with copying the stuff, because if the legislation is elsewhere, nobody goes back and they go redraft all them things when you have them thing out there. Every law you have, you could find one somewhere before. All you gotta do is take it and tailor it to your needs. That's the way it works. But it says to ensure that the code will be practical and effective. The government have consulted the law enforcement agencies that will use this code. So they've consulted with the agencies. In this case, I'm suggesting you use police, immigration, and customs. Representatives of the legal profession. So they went outside to show you how serious it is. They went outside to seek advice from the bar. They said devolved administrations, other organizations, and interested government departments. And they came together and put this code together. And we want to put an important code like this in the hands of one person. Be it minister, be it governor, it is wrong. And then look at 3. 430K3. A failure of a law enforcement officer to comply with any provision of the code does not of itself render the law enforcement officer liable to any criminal or civil proceedings. You hear the nonsense again? You see the behavior? Premier, you see what I'm saying? So you're basically cutting discretionary powers of ministers. Ministers mustn't do this, ministers mustn't do that, they mustn't do the other. But on the other hand, look at what you're saying. You're absolving a law enforcement officer of criminal and civil liability for any failings under this act. That's what we want to do. I thought that nobody was above the law. If the law says you're supposed to do X, Y, that's why I said the code is supposed to be, because this, Madam Speaker, this is where the very abuse comes in. This is where the very abuse that I'm talking about comes in. Because if you know that under this act that gives you sweeping powers without a warrant, that you will not be held liable for any criminal or civil actions that you take, you're going to exercise any duty of care with anybody out there on the sea with you, the ship, and Jesus? I take the incursions on my civil liberties and the civil liberties of other people very, very seriously. And so, Madam Speaker, in wrapping up, I can support the bill, but my support is contingent upon a code of practice being put in place before those sections, the 430 sections that give these sweeping powers to law enforcement officers, take effect. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you.